Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Politeia event at which we're going to discuss UK divergence from EU science and how Brexit could unleash greater innovation to benefit business, consumers, health and the environment. A warm welcome to all of you joining this event live, and also to those of you watching afterwards on YouTube as well, because we are indeed recording proceedings. Now, there could hardly have been a more appropriate moment to be holding this event. Over the last few weeks, we've witnessed the authorities in a newly sovereign UK approving and delivering the COVID-19 vaccine at a far greater pace than their European Union counterparts. Over 7.5 million vaccinations have already been done in the UK, more than Germany, Italy, France and Spain combined, and not that far off the total for the entire European Union. And the EU bodies have been slower both to approve the vaccines and indeed to order them. Of course, the European Medicines Agency hasn't yet even approved the AstraZeneca vaccine, about which there's been so much controversy this week. And just yesterday, no less an august an organ than German newspaper Die Zeit condemned the European Commission for acting slowly, bureaucratically, and in a protectionist way over its handling of the vaccines. And the paper concluded in an editorial, and I quote, "This is how many Britons see the EU, and their prejudices have been confirmed this week. The European Commission is currently providing the best advertisement for Brexit." So, following the UK's withdrawal from the EU, there's no doubt that the opportunity clearly presents itself to diverge from existing regulations covering science and technology, which raises a number of pertinent questions for us to consider today. Where does the UK approach differ to that of the EU in respect of scientific research, technological innovation and medicine approvals? Has the EU been too wedded to precautionary principles? Have EU regulations hindered the development of products and services by British businesses? If so, what does the government need to do to allow that freedom to innovate? Did EU membership or regulation affect the UK's approach to public health? Will the UK's new status as a legally independent country change things? And could legal independence from the EU impact areas such as energy and the environment? The opportunities were brought alive to me in an article just a couple of weeks ago on CapEx by Harry Phibbs, who identified his personal top 10 EU regulations the government should now scrap. And by my reckoning, 4 of those were in the areas covered by today's topic, namely the Genetically Modified Organisms Directive, which inhibits the fight against malaria, the Clinical Trials Directive, which hinders patients' access to innovative treatment options, the registration, evaluation, authorization and restriction of chemicals, which requires a huge amount of unnecessary animal testing at a cost of billions, the Tobacco Products Directive, which imposes restrictions on e-cigarettes and vaping, which many have found to be an effective way of giving up smoking. Now, I'm sure these and other issues will be raised by our speakers, so let me waste no further time and introduce our eminent lineup in the order in which I'm going to ask them to speak. Firstly, we'll hear from Matt Ridley, a biologist, journalist and award-winning author who sat in the House of Lords as a Conservative as Viscount Ridley since 2013 and was a backer of Vote Leave at the referendum in 2016. A fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, he's a former science editor of The Economist and author of numerous publications, including How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. Then from the House of Commons, we have Graham Stringer, a Labour MP since 1997, who represents the Manchester seat of Blakely and Broughton. He served as a junior minister in the Blair government and for the best part of 15 years has been a member of the Science and Technology Select Committee, appropriate enough for someone who prior to entering Parliament worked as an analytical chemist in the plastics industry. He's also a former leader of Manchester City Council and was an activist in the pro-Brexit Labour Leave group. Our third speaker will be Angus Dalglish, who has a distinguished career in medicine. The Foundation Professor of Oncology at St George's University of London. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of Pathologists. He sits on 8 editorial boards and is the co-editor of 5 medical books. And during the EU referendum, he was a spokesman for the pro-Leave group Scientists for Britain, having been a candidate for UKIP in 2015 in the constituency of Sutton and Sheen, which is where I happen to have grown up. And finally, we hope to hear from Terence Keeley, who's probably best known to Politeia as the
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, I can.
I'm sorry about the delay.
Don't worry. Well, Terence, I'm just going through the speakers
Thank
in
you.
the order in which I'll ask you to speak. Terence is best known to you as the former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham, where he was also Professor of Clinical Biochemistry, having initially trained in medicine at Bart's Hospital Medical School as a clinical biochemist. He then studied human experimental dermatology, and his publications include The Economic Laws of Scientific Research. And now he's an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute in Washington, DC. After each of our speakers have made their remarks, I'll then open the discussion to the virtual floor. You can use the chat function to submit any questions that you'd like me to put to the panelists, or if you want to raise your hand, we can probably try and even get you up on the screen with audio and or video, although the chat function is probably the easiest way of doing it. So without further ado, could I give the floor to Matt Ridley, Viscount Ridley.
Very distinguished people to follow me, so I'll try not to take up too much of your time. As Jonathan says, this is a very timely moment to talk about the EU and science because of the row with AstraZeneca and Oxford University. And I think this is showing very much the mercantilist nature of the European Union, the way in which it doesn't see trade as something that happens between individuals and businesses, but something that is directed by politicians. Also, it shows the zero-sum thinking that we've become accustomed to during the negotiations over Brexit and over the free trade agreement, that essentially Monsieur Barnier sees the world in terms of winners and losers in terms of trade, not in terms of mutual gain and potential winners on both sides. But I'm afraid that the row is also showing how unscrupulous people sometimes are in pursuit of the European dream. For me, the leaking to Handelsblatt of false information about the efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine in elderly people is a truly shocking episode in the story. And it may be that it wasn't deliberate, that it was accidental and misunderstood or something like that. But if not, then I think it's the sort of occasion on which, frankly, if I was Foreign Secretary, I'd be calling in the German ambassador for a conversation without coffee. The UK vaccine strategy, as Jonathan says, has been a good lesson in how to do innovation and commercial application of research outside the European Union. The Oxford vaccine is not just a new vaccine, it's to some extent a new type of vaccine. The viral vector vaccine is a new approach which has already proved to be able to produce a flu vaccine that is more universal than most flu vaccines usually are. And the strength of British research in this area is very notable. Ever since evolution, the double helix, in vitro fertilization, all the other DNA fingerprinting, we have been extraordinary leaders in biology and biotechnology in this country. But I think one of the lessons it teaches is the role of regulation and the role of more nimble and agile regulation in particular. The Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency has achieved a rapid and effective approval of these early vaccines, in contrast to the European Medicines Agency in particular, by being agile and nimble, but also very specifically by judging data in parallel, not in sequence. And I was party to a conversation recently with the head of infectious diseases at the Gates Foundation, who said that one of the good things about the pandemic is that we now find that regulators do return our calls at once, rather than saying we can't fix up a meeting for you in 3 months. And I actually recall during the referendum campaign, sitting on the Science and Technology Committee in the Lords, we took an inquiry on science after Brexit, and speaker after speaker told us that we were doomed if we left. Angus Dalglish, I think, was probably one of the very few exceptions to that, who came and said we'd be fine. But Sir Michael Rawlins, the head of the MHRA, was very interesting because, while of course staying on script that we shouldn't leave the European Union, he did guardedly admit that the European Medicines Agency simply added delay to the MHRA's decisions even then, and that he was itching to get into a more parallel way of working so as to speed up approvals. And I think one of the big lessons of leaving the European Union is not that we should wholesale repeal legislation, much as we might like to. It's very difficult to achieve that without scaring people, but that we should speed up decision making. It's not that regulators say no, it's that they take an age to say yes. And if you think of a couple of examples, BASF trying to get a blight-resistant potato through the European system basically took 8 years of Kafkaesque and comedic stuff trying to get approval. ending in BASF saying, well, forget it. We're not interested anymore. We're banging our head against this brick wall. We're off to America with our research, and you can continue to use fungicides in your potatoes in Europe if you want. But a similar story with Dyson. Sir James Dyson inventing a bagless vacuum cleaner, going to the European Union and finding that the Germans had got there first and lobbied the Commission to pass a rule saying that all vacuum cleaners must be tested without dust, so that the great benefit of his machine was not visible. He ended up going to the European Court. The European Court was heavily lobbied behind the scenes about this, which he found out by freedom of information. Eventually, he was able to win on appeal, but by then 5 years had elapsed. The Chinese competitors had caught up and his advantage was gone. So it's speed of decision-making that is crucial. One thing I'd like to just end on is that I think the future for technology is going to be much more about bio than we think. That is to say, the dominance of the digital information technology area in the field of innovation is, I suspect, coming to an end. And that in the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to be learning much more about bio. Now, in life sciences, as I say, not only is Britain very good at research, it's actually quite good at application. The old British disease that we invent things or discover things, but we don't apply them very well, is simply not so true in this area. And to give you an example, genomic sequencing is something we do an awful lot of in this country. I think we've done more sequences of viruses, coronaviruses in this country than pretty well the rest of the world put together. And as a result, of course, we've discovered the new variants and we've got a bad name for it, as if we're inventing them rather than discovering them, but that's a side point. But one of the things we've done in this country is make this genomic knowledge through things like Biobank somewhat closer to clinical application than in other countries, where it's mostly an academic research discipline. And that is creating something of a gold rush of companies wanting to move to this country, wanting to start in this country, to apply genomic knowledge to things like cancer treatment. I'm sure Gus Dalglish knows much more about this than I am, so I won't go into any detail. But we are well placed, but only if we learn the lesson of nimble, agile, and rapid regulatory reform of this area to allow us to unleash entrepreneurial energy. Because innovation in this area, more than any other area, is going to save lives and improve people's lives. It's a crime to stand in its way. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, very much indeed for that. Could I ask Graham Stringer to take the floor? Graham Stringer, MP.
You can, Jonathan, although I feel there's almost nothing left to say. Matt's covered a great deal there, but while we are boasting about UK science and how well we have done both in getting a vaccine into people's arms in great numbers and how poorly the EU has done, I went to see the Public Health Director in Salford. My constituency covers a little bit of Salford as well as most of North Manchester, a fortnight last Friday, and at that time he was boasting that Salford had vaccinated more people than France, which I thought was a staggeringly impressive statistic. I campaigned against the European Union, not because of science, not because of the economy, but primarily on a democratic basis, that I thought that, and still think, that we should be able to change our laws when the electorate decide, and we should be able to throw out the people who make our laws when we want to. That's not possible in the EU, and that is where the inflexibility both of the lawmaking, regulatory making process within the EU and the difficulty in reversing that process impacts on science. There are a number of examples in the Science and Technology Committee that we have looked at in some detail. Matt mentioned the Clinical Trials Directive of 2001. It took 17 years, I think it was, to change that. Undoubtedly improved it, although many of the clinicians who operated the Trials Directive had gone, and Europe and the UK had lost a whole area of science there. Secondly, and this was saved at the last minute, really, the Physical Agents Directive, the Science and Technology Committee looked at that when it was first proposed. There had been almost no consultation on the Physical Agents Directive. And it was about to, had it been passed in its original form, it would have switched off most of the magnetic resonance imaging machines in our hospitals and elsewhere, and it would have been a diagnostic disaster. So that process of making regulations is deeply flawed. There isn't a perfect way anywhere in the world of making regulations, but it is particularly flawed in the EU in the way that on one side a number of groups like Greenpeace and large multinational companies, again as Matt said, have disproportionate influence on the European Commission when it has come to prioritising diesel engines, which may have produced less carbon dioxide but poisoned us all. The restriction on genetically modified organisms has been a triumph for Greenpeace, if not for, it's been a disaster for the agricultural industry in this country, and a lot of it has just simply moved to the States and elsewhere. So there's example after example where the regulatory process has damaged science. And the question that's asked in the first part of this presentation is there an overuse of the precautionary principle? And I think the answer to that is very definitely yes, because what the precautionary principle does, it reverses the burden of proof. You end up not saying there's having to prove a negative in fact, and doing a lot more tests, which is one of the reasons genetically modified organisms haven't managed to get through the European regulatory process. Again, when the Science and Technology Committee looked at the precautionary principle, I was surprised to find that there is no agreed scientific definition of the precautionary principle. So if you can say we don't know the impact of this in a particular way, in a particular circumstance, then you can stop an innovative process, an innovative design of something taking place. I think, and I will finish on this point, that one of the reasons a majority of scientists were in favour of remaining in the EU was that they had got used to funding from the Horizon 2020 programme. And there was within that programme, depending which year we were in, there was a net benefit to UK science of between 1.3 and 1.6 billion. What was never said in that process was that overall, we were a net contributor, not just to the overall EU budget, to the science budget, because another part of the science budget through the regional funds outweighed the benefit we were getting from Horizon 2020. The other thing that also isn't often said, and it is a question worth asking, about EU universities. If you look at the top 100 universities in the world, and one can argue about the rankings, there are different rankings, but essentially they all come out very similarly. You have to get to number 50 before you get to a university in the EU. I think there are 11 out of the 100, whereas there are twice that number from the UK and twice that number again from the United States. So although Horizon 2020 has focused a lot of university research in this country onto those partnerships, many of which have been beneficial with universities within the EU, there are other universities of a higher standard out there that partnerships can work with. So I will simply finish by agreeing with what Matt said, that the benefit of being outside the EU really is the speed of which regulations can be formed, and the process of making laws and regulations in this country is more flexible, and the process we go through, we're much more likely to get it right than the bureaucratic over-influenced by lobbying methods within the European Union.
Thank you, Graham, very much indeed. Could I ask Angus Dalglish to unmute and take the floor?
Thank you very much indeed for asking me to contribute here. I'm basically going to go over my own experiences as to why I feel so strongly that we were much better off outside the European Union. I was basically doing my research, and we'd evolved into cancer vaccines of different descriptions, and we built up a very sizable investment in dendritic cell therapy. That's where you expand antigen-presenting cells from a patient by taking their blood and then culturing them, manipulating them in the laboratory, making a vaccine, giving it back to the patients. And we had shown we had very good results, not just in melanoma, but in solid tumor patients as well. And you can imagine my amazement when I was told by the powers that be in the university that I would have to stop this after the 1st of April, because I would go from being a pioneer in my research to being a criminal, because I would be breaching the European Union Clinical Trial Directive, which had all kinds of detail, the bottom line of which is that I would not be able to work in a laboratory that had very few dirt particles, like in a million. I mean, the difference was absolutely minuscule. Put it another way, to upgrade to this facility would cost £2.7 million, of which nobody was going to give that money or support it. So at a stroke, they destroyed my career there, and I had to adapt accordingly, but I could not believe that. My next experience is being invited to go and be an examiner and a referee on all the grant applications that go into the European Union. This was just pre-2020 of the framework programme. So you can imagine my amazement that when I saw exactly how it worked, I had to go to Brussels for a week. And in that time, I became very aware that we were really being wined and dined and smoothed in order to rubber stamp decisions that had already been made, which were anything but refereeing or democratic whatsoever. They had decided, these unelected bureaucrats, which groups they wanted to support, and we were there basically to tick boxes until we came to the right decision. So it's the same way as they treat the electorate. You have an election, and if you don't get the right answer, you do it again. We felt very much that this was going on. I basically refused to participate in this when I realized just how blatant it was. and went to complain to the person at the top of the building in Brussels who was in charge of this, and complained bitterly that this was going on, and it was a tremendous waste of my time, resources and people's careers. I was told that it was surely some mistake. Well, at least the people they wanted to fund exclusively no longer got funded exclusively after my outburst, and at least 3 groups of teams got funded. But that was enough for me. That I knew then that we were dealing with a totally corrupt, manipulated organisation, which were there to give us back our money. And more importantly, to completely waste my time as well. Now, the other thing that I've got involved with in time is getting drugs approved and regulated. And one of the ones that I was involved with came out of my vaccine program. And it was we found actually it was one of the most effective drugs that we'd worked with. And it was one which we call a heat-killed mycobacteria called IMM 101. And I'd worked on this in melanoma and pancreatic cancer, and we had really good results, survival benefits in pancreatic cancer combined with chemo versus chemo alone, really good results. We took this to the European, the EMA, and basically they said that it was fantastic results, but under their laws, we would have to do another trial similarly, because they wanted 2 such randomized studies. And this then opened the gates to realizing that all this is for big pharma. All this is for big pharma to keep out the little boys, to drown the academic thing unless it's been taken over by big pharma. Essentially, they stopped that development in the track. When I presented it at a meeting, I was told, I was approached by a member of the MHRA, said if it wasn't for the EMA, they would approve it straight away, because it's clear there was no toxicity and clear evidence of efficacy. And based on that, they would approve it. So hopefully, now that we're out of the EU, the MHRA will come good on those sort of promises, which I have every hope that they will, because of the way they've approved the vaccine. And you can see today how what's going on with the vaccine. The European Union still haven't approved, and unless correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand they still haven't actually approved the vaccines which they're fighting about, which they want to give, was certainly one of them, which they want to give our British ones to them. So I think it's a fantastic opportunity. I really feel that I've been released from this, and that it would be the start of being able to negotiate. Now, some people will cause trouble in authorities and the government here, but at least we know who they are, and at least we can actually have a discourse and a good interchange and get our points across. With the EU, you could not. And everybody, as you made a very good point about scientists, actually thought the EU was wonderful because it was giving them all the money. They were actually typical examples of the Stockholm syndrome. They were in fall to some, they'd basically gotten to the point where they thought they were getting more money than they paid in, when you were quite right, they actually were getting far less money because so much money went into the other fund of infrastructure. And I remember when we had Brexit debates, arguing that so much of this money was totally unaccounted for. And Mike Goldsworthy, he was often on the other side, scientist for Europe, admitted many times that they would gradually get the corruption under control. Well, this has been going on for over a decade, and he freely admitted that a lot of this fund was they just couldn't control it because of corruption. Now I feel so liberated that we're away from that, and we can use our own regulators to get our own innovation, which I think is so important. We have great innovation in this country, and the EU would just tangle us up to the point where anybody who wanted to consider doing it went off to the US. And I think I've probably spoken long enough, and happy to answer questions later if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus, very much indeed. And finally, from the 4 panelists, Terence Keeley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. There is a fundamental philosophical difference between the way English-speaking countries and continental European countries view science. And in simple words, the British and the Americans created their industrial revolutions in the complete absence of the government funding of science. It's one of the great historical facts. Whereas continental Europe caught up with the British and the Americans, thanks in part to the government funding of their science. So their governments view science in the proprietal way, historically. This is 2 or 3 centuries we're talking about. Whereas the British and Americans have always understood that science is an integral part of the free market. And you can see this, for example, to this day in the way grants are allocated. You submit a grant to the MRC or the other bodies that we scientists traditionally in this country submit grants to. And as far as we can tell, they are judged in terms of quality. That is it. That is the beginning and end of that judgment. But European Union grants are clearly subordinate to a wider geopolitical mission. You can't submit a grant, even if you're going to cure cancer tomorrow, as well as fuse atoms tomorrow and triple GDP per capita tomorrow, all in one day. You could not submit that grant to the EU unless you did it in collaboration with 2 or 3 other countries and universities in other countries. So this is science being used by the EU as part of a wider geopolitical project. And it comes from that real sense of proprietorship that continental governments have towards science that Anglo-Saxon governments don't have. Now, my former people earlier have talked about the corruption of EU funding of science. I would put it differently and less, and this now is less complementary towards the Anglo-Saxon model. Something that is so rarely talked about, even in England or America, is the fact that the government funding of science has absolutely zero economic benefit. It may have other benefits, I'm not going to discuss those, but it has zero economic benefit. And it's completely forgotten now, and it is still completely forgotten, that the government funding of science in this country in America basically started in the wake of Sputnik. There was an American economist called Arrow, he won a Nobel Prize, who explained that the Russians were going to overtake us economically because the government funded science in Russia and we didn't have the same here. And so we then copied Sputnik. So in America, in England, we had the white heat of the technological revolution under Harold Wilson. In America, they had ARPA and all those other huge government funding of science, and the economic benefit was precisely zero. So we should understand, even in England and America, why governments fund science. It's not to stimulate economic growth. Now, you could argue there are other reasons as well, which are very, very valid, and one could accept that. But no one should be naive about this. One of the reasons governments fund science in England and America is just to keep scientists quiet. It's a very modest sum of money, throwing a few billions to the NSF and equivalent bodies in this country, just to stop the universities lobbying against government. And so in the EU, that money is used by government for very different reasons in terms of the Stockholm Syndrome, as we've just heard, but we have a version of the Stockholm Syndrome as well in Britain. And so one of the interesting facts about the government funding of science is the way globally there is so much less than there used to be. Even in the mid-1960s, 2/3 of all research and development, which is a wider category in science, 2/3 of all research and development in Britain and America was funded by the government, i.e. governments funded companies to do research and development. Now it's down to certain missions and of course the universities. So to conclude, we historically in England and America have known historically from the work of Adam Smith and others that the government funding of science is not necessary and we became rich without it. The continentals, governments feel they own science because they think they became rich through the government funding of science. They are completely wrong. We have gone wrong in the recent past, but very quietly, without anyone noticing, government is increasingly withdrawing from science, even in England and America, apart from university science and medical science and space science and environmental science, specific missions. But the idea of science as a public good that governments have to fund is now no longer discreetly and quietly believed, even in England and America. And to finally conclude, the EU is a geopolitical project. Science is subordinate to the purposes of that project. So of course, to our eyes, it looks completely corrupted and distorted. There's a reason why of the top 50 universities, not one is in the EU. And the reason for that is that our science in England and America is highly competitive. In European science, it's more important to collaborate with other people across a border than to aim for the best possible science. They get their grants by a process of exhaustion. How many bureaucratic hoops are they prepared to go through before they finally get their grants? We get our grants because of quality. Ours is a much better model, but even ours does have this huge ideological fault that we have increasingly forgotten that the government funding of science is not of economic benefit. It may have non-economic benefits, but there is no economic benefit to the government funding of science, not even in England or America. Thank you.
Thank you, Terence, very much indeed. So I would certainly encourage any of the attendees to either put questions in the chat function, which I can put to the panelists, or if you want to go to the raise your hand button, then we can hopefully put you on. I see one person who I'm going to come to in just one second. I'll come to Martin Rees in a moment. But first of all, I just want I mentioned in my introduction the Tobacco Products Directive, and Graham in his comments talked about the precautionary principle that the EU had adopted. I wondered if any of you felt that that precautionary principle was effectively hindering advances and innovation in public health, because through some of the decisions that they made. And I say on the Tobacco Products Directive, I was thinking about how, you know, it cracks down on vaping, which strikes me as an obvious way of getting people off of cigarettes, for example. Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I think the I mean, at its simplest, the precautionary principle sounds very sensible. Let's better be safe than sorry. Let's not take ignorance as a reason for assuming something's safe. But it has been hugely distorted and baked into the European system through the Lisbon Treaty in a form that, as Graham very eloquently said, reverses the burden of proof and effectively means that the new has to prove itself to be safe, whereas the old can go on being unsafe. So an existing technology, you think about the benefits and the hazards of it, but the new, something that's being considered for the first time, you think about the hazards only, and you're not allowed to take into account the potential benefits, which would include displacing a less safe technology. The clearest example of this, of course, is in genetically modified crops. And it's great news that this government is doing a consultation on gene editing, following lobbying I've been doing in the House of Lords on this, and is looking at possibly lessening the barriers to these products coming forward. But vaping is another good example. A technology that is safer but not perfectly safe has come along to displace a technology that is dangerous and that people are addicted to. The argument for that is harm reduction. It's an argument we've been using in this country for a long time, particularly with respect to handing out needles to drug addicts so they don't get AIDS and so on. It's an argument that simply doesn't cut it in much of the rest of the world, and I don't understand why. I don't think you can do away with the precautionary principle. I think that would frighten people too much. What I think you do is you balance it with an innovation principle. So you say, before we pass this legislation, will it stifle or suppress innovation? And if so, are we sure that's a good thing? So at least we pause and balance the two sides. We talk about the benefits of an innovation as well as the hazards of an innovation. Sorry, just one more thing I wanted to add to what Terence said about the way the European Union insists on collaborative grants across countries. There was a point some years ago when it dawned on me that this system wasn't ideal, when my wife was involved in a collaborative research project across different countries. And one of the collaborative partners in one country had spent nothing in the period she was reporting on. Which was fine. It was, so she had to fill in the form that they'd spent nothing. She filled it in as €0. The form was returned and said, no, you must put 0 pesetas or whatever it was. I mean, I can't remember the currency, but it was the currency that was wrong, not the word zero. What an extraordinary system.
Did anyone else want to come back on any of those points, or shall I go? I was going to ask a more general question of the panel, which was to say, is there a danger that, obviously having reclaimed powers from Brussels, brought them back to Westminster over a whole load of these areas, is there a danger that a kind of British bureaucracy merely replicates some of what was happening in Brussels, and what the panel think can be done to prevent that from happening? if one of you would like to take that on.
Well, may I just very briefly say
Terence.
that I think that, I mean, I am a supporter of the European Union, and I very much regret the European Union is failing to do what I hoped it might do. But I think British scientists collectively are mavericks. They are highly individualistic. I mean, you couldn't imagine Lord Rees, for example, who we may not be hearing him, but no one's going to tell Lord Rees how to do his research. And we have a much more democratic bottom-up spirit of science in Britain and in America, which is one of the reasons why so many industrial innovations come from the English-speaking world as well, particularly now America. So no, I think that British science, once it's become free of the European Union, will definitely not fall into the bureaucratic mess that you are worried about.
I'm less optimistic about that than Terence, because I've seen the way Britain's gold plate rules that come from the European Union and often implement them much more severely than say Italians do, for example. So I do think it's an issue, it's a problem, and we've started, of course, by wholesale importing European regulations into British law. The one thing I would say is that there might be room for regulatory activism of a very libertarian kind. If you look at what happened under the Clinton administration in the late 1990s, a series of measures were pushed through Congress to deliberately create an easy possibility for online commerce to get going, for e-commerce, as it were. Now, we're living with some of the problems of those decisions now in terms of the power of Facebook and so on. But nonetheless, it's not an accident that e-commerce took off when it did. Some legislation did achieve that. So I think it's important for people who want innovation to happen to think of sometimes being quite activist in terms of regulations that make it easy for people to do things. It's very dangerous, of course, because it gets hijacked by people who want to do the opposite. Can I say one thing to Terence also? The one argument I've always had a trouble with from his perspective is the fact that 40% of my money goes to the government. And I'm quite glad some of that finds its way back into science and technology and innovation, because if it didn't, then that would be lost from the system. I'm sure Terence has a good.
I'm sorry, you got cut off. Can you repeat what you said, Matt? You got cut off.
40% of my money goes to the government. I'm glad some of it finds its way back into science and technology.
You absolutely should not, because all it does, I'm afraid, if you're thinking in terms of economics, all it does is crowd out the best scientists. The cruel reality is that if you create beautifully funded universities where scientists are treated like kings and queens and have every facility they want, you're going to get scientists moving out of industry and going into the universities. Why do we have vaccines? Because of BioNTech and other free market activities where top scientists are saving us. We may need a public sector in science. I'm prepared to have that discussion, but no one should think there's not a price to be paid for taking the best scientists out of the market and putting them into, hate to use a cliche, ivory towers.
Can I just try and answer the original question about whether or not we're going to free ourselves from European regulations in science? I hope we do, but certainly within the Commons, from the majority of people who didn't want us to leave the European Union, it is quickly becoming a test of new regulations or a change in regulations of whether it is the same as the European Union. I think that's a bad test, certainly competition with European Union regulations. It's sensible to understand that, but there is definitely an inertia among some MPs that they actually want us, they think it's a general good to stay aligned with the European Union.
Just to interject, to make something interesting here, your great enemy may be Boris Johnson, because if you read the speech he gave at Greenwich the day after we left the European Union, or the day before, anyway, to coincide with our leaving the European Union, he boasted in that Greenwich hospital speech that our regulations were tighter and had higher safety standards than in the European Union, which he represented as a ghastly free market hellhole where standards had been abandoned. It was a very strange speech.
There's one very simple reg that I think we should tear up in some form, and that's the one that insists on that darned little cookies thing coming up every time I open a website. That is part of a GDPR regulation that has effectively created a barrier to entry against smaller competitors to the big digital giants. And it is a huge pain for all of us every day. We've got used to it. We click on, but we never read. We never say. Has anyone here ever clicked "I don't agree" to your cookies? Of course, we all click agree. So it's the the law is an ass when it's that useless.
One question that's come in through the chat function, and please, if other people want to do that, then do put your comments in there. Paul Holland asks, are we restricted at all in this area by the level playing field restrictions that the EU sought to bind us to in the free trade agreement? Is there a quick answer to that from Matt? You've just unmuted. Go on.
Yeah, I mean, mostly it applies to labour regulations and things like that, but also environmental regulations. And that's where I think there will be a problem in this respect, because I think there's often quite a lot of different ways of doing environmental protection and improvement better than but the particular way that's been chosen by the European regulations. So, for example, I suspect it may be possible to use gene drive to drive grey squirrels extinct so as to save red squirrels in this country one day. Right. Now, that would be a technology that would be completely incompatible with European regs, but might be very good at saving a species from extinction. I deliberately chose a pretty controversial and sort of difficult one to give you an example of the kind of things that might be possible.
Sure. Did anyone else want to come back on that at all? Another thing, we obviously, and it was Terence Keeley who put this most interestingly, the kind of difference between attitudes between European and Anglo-Saxon countries in terms of their attitude to science and how it's funded and so on. Does, is there potentially going to be more collaboration now between British scientists and American scientists? Is there going to be any kind of change in the balance around the world of where this research is done as a result of Brexit?
My answer to you would be that the very highest quality of science I don't think would be affected. I think that the EU has sucked in an awful lot of science, not of the very highest quality, that people have been prepared to undergo these collaborations and go through these terrible bureaucratic hoops. We just heard that someone had to spend a whole week in Brussels just reading these things. And that's not quite the top level of science. The very top level of science has always found its own level. And there's no question that a brilliant scientist in Cambridge who wanted to collaborate with anyone, whether it was in New York or Sydney, Australia, or indeed Moscow, would have done so irrespective. But I think there's a possibility that the slightly lower level of science, collaboration will cease to become an end in itself, and people will collaborate much more discriminatingly, because the money will still be there, but it'll be funded in different ways. So I think in terms of the quality of science, it's actually a good thing that people are no longer being forced into these European collaborations. And yes, to answer your question, collaborations will now find their natural level, which will be healthier.
Thanks. Graham, are you trying to unmute or no? I have a message from Martin Rees, Lord Rees, who we were unable to get on the microphone, although we did see him. He tells us he was going to agree with Matt Ridley on the precautionary principle, but more importantly, the question he wanted to put to the panel was why they thought it was that the overwhelming majority of the scientific community support Remain. Is it simply a case of money? Professor Dalglish, what do you think?
Well, I've had to put up with this for several years, and I really found it very difficult to understand why so many of my colleagues, I mean, 95% at least, were openly hostile to the idea of any alternative to the EU system that they had adopted so well and so quickly. And as I just repeat the term Stockholm syndrome again, it's rather like that they were hostage to a system that they had put up with and felt they were doing much better by. I mean, when the idea that we might leave the European Union and we had these scientific debates, I mean, they were just basically completely irrational in the doom and gloom that they predicted and the death of science in the UK. Nobody will ever want to come here again. And I really could not understand it at all, and how universal it was. In contrast with my medical colleagues, the number of medical colleagues who thought that it would probably be a good idea to leave the EU was about 50-50. So this incredible high percentage of the scientific community was really quite strange. And I am still putting up with it, but I just let you know, for some visions of optimism, I've had at least 2 of the senior scientists who've come up to me unsolicited and said, you know how keen we were to stay in the EU. Having seen the way they've treated us over the last few weeks, I've changed my mind, and hopefully that will go for a lot of them.
I think
Graham.
Sorry, I think there are 2 reasons. In the run-up to the 2016 referendum, I went round most of the sort of British universities, from Oxford and Cambridge to Glasgow. There were very few universities I didn't go to. And most of the debates, they started off with about 90% of people being in favour of remaining, and ended up with about 87% of people being in favour of remaining. I think that was just the view of a lot of people from our backgrounds, educated people who are in universities. One could simply say it's a sort of Nigel Farage effect that went through lots of the educated middle class. If Nigel is on that side, we're on the opposite side. It wasn't a thought through position. And I don't think scientists were any different from other academics in universities in that respect. And the other point, of course, is if you were getting funding through Horizon 2020, then it's very disruptive. There's no doubt it is disruptive. If you're not one of the the very top scientists that Terence is talking about, where you can collaborate with whichever university and with whichever other scientists you want to, because you're absolutely at the top of your field, getting funding is difficult, and that was a disruptive process.
I have a question that has come through from Gwithian Prince, who says, extending Terence Keeley's last point about the painted horse speech, does the panel share my growing anxiety about prescription on research topics in global systems dynamics and in energy systems? The green narrative, combined with rent-seeking pressures, have already created UK bureaucratic selection procedures not dissimilar from the experience that Gus Dalglish described. And if anyone shares this anxiety, what is to be done to restore proper procedures? Anyone want to take that on? Matt?
Yes, I do share Gwithian's concern here. And I think it isn't just Britain or Europe. It's true elsewhere. I mean, even before the American election, I was hearing people in the US say more and more industrial strategy is in vogue here, where we want to tell people what to go out and invent. And there's going to be good inventions called green ones, and there's going to be bad inventions called fracking and things like that. And that does disturb me, because I think it doesn't recognize the bottom-up nature of innovation, that it comes up with unexpected solutions from unexpected directions to problems. In the energy field in particular, I think there's a real danger that it's like saying in 1950, right, by the year 2000, we will have routine space travel, personal jetpacks, flying cars, supersonic airliners in the air, and you've jolly well got to invent them. Well, it turned out it wasn't very easy to invent those things. They weren't economic. They didn't make sense. even though they were absolutely standard in the vision of the future that everybody had in 1950. And nobody at the same time saw coming the internet, mobile phones, all that kind of stuff. So they thought the future was going to be all about transport. In fact, it was all about IT. Likewise, if we say now, by 2050, we will have batteries that can make wind power economic, I suspect we're bumping up against the second law of thermodynamics, and it may not be that easy. Something like 93% of our energy comes from burning things, from either burning wood or burning oil, coal, and gas at the moment. That number hasn't changed much in the last 20 years because the proportion from nuclear has gone down while the proportion from renewables has gone up. So we're not solving this problem yet. If we went cold turkey on fossil fuels tomorrow, living standards would plummet. And I'm not sure that we know that we can solve that problem. And I think we should be looking at all options, including, cleaner versions of fossil fuels like gas displacing coal and things like that. But Graham knows more about this than I do, so I'll leave it to him.
I'm not sure that's true. I was going to approach you from a slightly different, from a straightforwardly political point of view. Yes, I think there is a real danger that governments state what research will find, where it will be directed. My worry as a Labour politician is that my party seems to have forgotten its basic mission, in as much as all the solutions that have been put forward since Ed Miliband was Energy Secretary have increased the costs of fuel to the poorest people in this country. So it's probably a threat to science. It will not stop scientists getting funding because they will badge everything as an energy project and a green project. When Richard Nixon said he was going to cure America was going to cure cancer in however many years it was, I think it was a decade, following Kennedy's decision to send people to the moon by the end of the 1960s, but a large number of projects that had nothing to do with cancer started badging themselves as cancer projects. So it will distort science in that way, and it will distort society, certainly in a way that I wouldn't wish society to be distorted.
Terence, do you want to come back? Yeah.
Well, just to add, I agree with everything that Graham said. I agree with everything Matt said. I agree with everything Grinnan said. I'm absolutely amazed that we are apparently going to have an industrial policy, such a strong industrial policy in Britain now. It seems to me that everybody knows that industrial policies don't work. There's no evidence that they have ever worked, apart from very poor countries trying to catch up with rich countries. But once you're rich, you just got to let the market rip. The only consolation we have is Moore's law, and I remember Matt teaching me about this, and I checked it up, and it's quite right. Moore's law, as everybody here knows, has been operating for well over a century, in fact, nearly 130 years. Every 2 years, the costs of transmitting information halves, every 2 years, and has done so for 130 years. This despite Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Chairman Mao, and every stupid policy that the British and the American governments have ever come up with. It seems, thank heavens, that despite the stupidity of our politicians, Graham accepted, obviously, technology continues its own inexorable route. Scientists and technologists manage to bypass those top-down nonsenses, and that we will probably be all right. But it won't be thanked to the painted hall speech, and it won't be thanks to a Brexity Hezza. Heseltine was wrong about that.
Thank you, Terence. I'm very aware that we've now hit 2 o'clock on the time, so I fear the Q&A I will bring to a conclusion there, and it gives me great pleasure to hand over the floor to Dr. Sheila Lawler, Politeia's founder, who will make some concluding remarks and give a vote of thanks. Sheila, over to you.
I just want to say a few words. I continue doing director of research at Politeia, and this has been an extraordinarily interesting session to hear from so many distinguished scientists and innovators who have brought together in one forum some of the great themes that will matter for the future. The need for our regulation, as Matt said, to be flexible, agile, and to accommodate innovation. Graham talked about innovation and how difficult it was to have innovative processes put through swiftly and rapidly when you had a number of groups, including the interest groups that you mentioned, Graham, putting up obstacles. And we heard firsthand from Angus Dalglish how these obstacles affected his very important research into melanoma. And he looks particularly forward to our doing it a different way in the UK. Terence raised another interesting point, which is how the EU views science as it is a project. And here perhaps I could add something about the EU's economic system, its constitutional system, its political system, which was molded for historical reasons in the image of the French dirigiste state, which would be controlled and commanded from the center. Now, for France, that was very important because it wanted to tie Germany into a cooperative and controlled model so as to control future economic and potentially military expansion. However, that model stays today in the European Union. And of course, its law follows. And what we've heard today are that the laws which our scientists and innovators have had to operate under, and which have constrained innovation, flexibility, and research. These laws are, like many laws, they reflect the original founding principles of the EU and its system, its controlled command and control model from the center. Now, the big challenge, in my view, that has emerged today is for our law to follow where its instincts are. And the common law tradition, by contrast with the protectionist model designed to promote the interests of the state, as it is the parties, our law is free. It has encouraged all along competition and freedom, and it allows people to innovate and to be to try and to follow, as Martin Rees put in a pamphlet for Politeia some years ago, to follow your hunch. So I'd like to thank you all very much indeed. And thank you, Jonathan.